Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking to Aruba, known as Roobz on Twitter. She has, quite a substantial audience there. She is a writer, social commentator, entrepreneur, and for almost a year now, wife. How's it going?
It's going good, Dean. I'm really, really happy to be here and happy to talk to you.
Well, catch us up a little bit about what you do outside of being a wife. What do you mean when you say that you're a writer and social commentator? Where do you do that?
Yeah, so I've been on Twitter for, I think it's now been like 4 years where I started to tweet, my opinions and my takes on just life in general. And since then, I've gotten a bunch of opportunities to appear on podcasts. I was on Zuby's podcast a couple of years ago, which ended up, really taking off. And so that's what I really mean when social commentator. It's just giving my personal take and opinion on life. I've studied psychology, and so that's what I really apply when I'm talking about life and human behavior, social behavior, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what, and then writer is like, I've had my own Substack. I've been writing on Twitter. And this is all just as a personal interest thing. I haven't really found a way to take it beyond that. Maybe in the future I'll write a book, but that's all open. The reason why I talk on Twitter is because it's my voice and it's my way of reaching people and helping them see what I see. Outside of that, I'm an entrepreneur. So I've been running my own marketing agency for the last 3 years. And that's also where I apply a lot of my teachings. And so I help people build personal brands. And to build a personal brand, you need to know how people relate to one another. You need to know what makes people click. You need to know how to, get into a person's personality and bring out the things that make them relatable. And so all of those things are interconnected. And so that's how my profession is kind of related to my interest, if that makes sense.
Sure. And a wife? You've been a wife for a while?
Yeah. So I got married last year in July, and it's been really, really good. There's a lot of things that I've learned about, just marriage, but also the female and male dynamic. And I haven't shared a lot of those things on Twitter because I think when I was younger, I was very eager to just talk and, just get my voice out. And as I've gotten older and as I have grown in my personal life, for example, through marriage, I've realized that there's a time and a way to say things to help people understand them. And I'm still doing that. Like I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about some of the things that I'm learning. And so this is like my first podcast that I'm doing in like, I think a year and a half,
Well, let's talk about all the things that you haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
How you've been on Twitter for 4 years, you said, and we've been in the same Twitter circle pretty much that whole time. What observations do you have about how things have changed in that time?
I think it's really interesting because I think a lot of things have just remained the same. Like when you think about it, people are still struggling with the same problems and talking about the same issues that they were when I joined 4 years ago. And a lot of those problems revolve around human relationships. So in the circle you and I are in, people are constantly talking about dating and relationships and marriage. That's the dominant topic. And it has been for the last 3 years. Like that's something that people are stuck on. And the way that I've seen it change, I would say, is that it's gotten more extreme. Like there's more podcasts around the relationship and dating topic. So what is that one with the guy and he's sitting around with like a bunch of girls, he invites a bunch of girls onto his podcast.
I think that's the Whatever podcast.
Yeah, the Whatever podcast. And so I think there's there's maybe more of an echo chamber around all of these things now as well, because people with really big followings are talking about these things and they're drawing a lot of attention to it. And so I know people that were in my friend group that didn't know anything about, what's an alpha male and what's like what's femininity and like being submissive, and like now they know.
Mhm.
So I think it's gotten to a scale where we've reached people outside of our circle.
I made that point in a conversation with someone else a while back that people who are not active Twitter users do not quite understand that Twitter is where our culture comes from. And that that 4 years ago, things that were being discussed to the hilt on Twitter are just now becoming mainstream topics, like you're
Mhm,
pointing out.
mhm.
And that if you're an active Twitter user and you pay attention to the conversation there, you can almost predict the future by 4 or 5 years because you will know where we're going.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I'm seeing that because I also think like Twitter is just a place where a lot of conversation happens. I don't see that happen on other platforms. I used to use Instagram really heavily, never saw that happen there because it isn't the medium for conversation. But Twitter is, because you can talk to other people live on their feed, and then that message can relate to somebody else that follows you, and that's how it just goes round and round. And so you're absolutely right. Like the biggest change I would say I've noticed is that the things we were talking about 4 years ago are now mainstream,
Mm.
and they're bigger than we expected. Like there's TikTok accounts of like women, dressing up as like a trad and like cooking and like trying to really push that message to the wider audience. And I would say that a lot of people are receptive to it.
Mhm.
Like Andrew Tate. Like he was, people don't believe it when I'm like, I remember when he was a small account, when he was
Oh,
being like roasted for, I think like, I don't know, he posted like his car or something,
absolutely.
and people were making fun of him. And now it's like he's this voice of influence to a whole generation.
Mhm.
It's crazy how Twitter can make you that authority figure in every, day-to-day life of
Right.
people.
Yes, it's very interesting. I talk via Zoom, either for the podcast or in the coaching I do with lots of people who follow me on Twitter. And I'll get on a Zoom call with someone in India who will say, I've been reading your tweets for 2 years and they've meant so much to me and they've influenced me so much. And I think I wrote that in the hallway at the library. It's the craziest thing. I'm just over here browsing the nonfiction, and I had an idea. Pop my phone out of my pocket,
Mhm,
type it out, hit post, and put the phone back.
mhm.
And then someone in Finland or India is reading it, and it is such a strange kind of experience. I'm sure you've had that experience.
And I think like that's what makes me want to keep doing it. It's not like this need to be famous. It's more of this responsibility that I feel like falls on my shoulders. And that might seem strange to some people like listening. They may be like, well, it's just a social platform. But I was literally having this conversation with Taylor Burrows. She's a relationship and dating coach. I was telling her, I'm like, I was in my comments talking to her, and I said, I miss when Twitter was about that. I miss when Twitter was about value, like people giving advice, because I know that a lot of advice that I got from Twitter changed my life.
Mhm.
Like you were one of the first people I followed, and I remember reading your things, and it really changed the trajectory of my life. And so I feel that responsibility to some extent, where it's like I need to grow as a human being so I can share my observations with other people that can help them grow.
Mhm.
And I think one of my biggest problems now with Twitter is that it's no longer about that. It's more about opinions. Like it's more about creating echo chambers around certain topics and just like trying to voice your opinion and put it out into the void. Like, oh, like, I think like, women suck, or like women do this or women do that, or men do this and men do that. And it's not really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's causing more problems than it's solving. And so when I think about the future, like like how you're saying we can look at Twitter and we can predict the future, I see a lot of disparity within people and how they relate to one another,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
It's interesting. Over the last 4 years or even longer, we have seen the development of this kind of trad life aesthetic. And what's interesting is that years ago, the traditionalist Twitter was very small. I remember having those discussions with Wrath of Genon. I don't know if you know Wrath of Genon.
I think so. I think I
and
remember. Yeah.
and a few other guys, and there was almost none of this, but it has exploded in a way, and it's like you say. I think people are so lost that they only, first of all, they're kind of insensitive, and they can only pick up what is an extreme,
Yeah.
and I think it is just human nature for most people to be focused on the surface. And so when they think about living a trad life, they think about dressing like a pioneer girl rather
Yeah.
rather than thinking, how do I conform my life to the eternal truths of virtue and goodness? And
Yeah.
so when I've always kind of held that what I mean when I say tradition is not the way things were done in the past, but rather what does it mean to live in accordance with what is eternally true? Those are,
Right.
and I think the second question gets lost on so many people because they just focus on the externalities of living
Right.
like a pioneer or something.
I think that's what really scares me about this entire movement is that there are a lot of women that did take the advice that was given out on Twitter, which was like, hey, you should just, marry a guy that, treats you well. And like, it doesn't matter if you love them. And because, traditional marriages are not based on chemistry, they're made based on, compatibility, or like you shouldn't even care about. There's so many varying pieces of advice that were given out at that time. And I actually know a handful of women that were negatively impacted by this. Like
How so?
they took this advice, they got married to somebody, and the person ended up just being a complete like weirdo. Like the person ended up being somebody who was either abusive, or like, the woman just realized like there was no real compatibility or like chemistry or any of the things that make a marriage actually work. And so they ended up divorcing. And so I think like that's what I think about a lot is like how many bad outcomes is this movement going to be responsible for?
Mm-hmm.
That's what scares me when I think about the future.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said, a lot of people are not thinking deeply about what tradition means or living a good life means. Like they really do think it means like I get married, like for males, it's I provide for my wife. And for females, it's I'm submissive to my husband. But then when things get tough, right, what does it mean to provide for your wife beyond just material, like beyond just going to work?
Mm-hmm.
And or like bringing in revenue or whatever that is. And then for women, like what does it mean to be submissive beyond like just I cook for my husband, and I make sure like I listen to him or whatever. Like where's the nuance in those situations? And I think that's what's missed in these conversations.
Mm-hmm. The I think a lot of what else is also missing is that a lot of the young people, especially who are picking up these messages, are doing so because they're desperate for some structure. Our culture offers you essentially zero education on how to structure a meaningful relationship other than does it feel good, is it fun, whatever.
Yeah.
And so young people pick up this sort of trad life meme,
Mhm.
try to build something meaningful on what are essentially aesthetics.
Yeah.
It doesn't work well. And the reason is because neither the trad life people nor our mainstream culture actually offers people any way to develop their skills at actually building intimacy with another person. And the women you're talking about, when you say their husbands ended up being total weirdos, I mean, that's what it means to be a total weirdo, is that you have no intimacy building skills.
Yeah.
You can't listen, you can't talk about yourself at a deep level, you can't respect other people, you don't know how to build a bond, basically.
100%. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, and I think relationships really draw that out of people, right? So you may think that you are perfectly fine as a person, and then you enter into a relationship, and being in close contact with another person's emotions and their moods and their ideologies and their behaviors and all of the structure that you think you have, it actually falls apart to some extent because you're like, hey, like I thought I was going to be good at responding to a certain situation, but in reality you're not, and you have to recalibrate. And so the social skills part, and I think that's largely a failure of just society in general,
Mhm.
where kids, or I have a younger sister, she when it was around COVID time, she was entering into high school. And so there was no high school because you couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't go in person to your classes or whatever that was. And so a large part of it was that people were just isolated, especially young people have just been isolated. But I mean, even, people my age, like I'll go outside and it's like people are afraid to make eye contact. People are afraid to like start conversations. People are buried into their phones, and like all of those things I feel like have led us down this path of just people having zero social skills. But also like just I don't know if like it's also culture, because there's a big difference I've noticed in culture, in the sense of like if I travel to like South Asia, or if I travel to Europe, there's a completely different atmosphere of
Mm.
how people talk and how people interact and like all these things. But when I come back to Canada, I almost think that it's a failure on the part of culture, where parents haven't taught anything to children in the sense of like, these are the things that you have to be doing, or these are the things that are right, or like, maybe this is what religion says about like relating to another person or whatever that is. I
Mhm.
just think all of those pieces are missing. It's hard to just narrow it down to one thing, because it's
Sure.
not one thing.
Yeah, I was mentioning this on Twitter yesterday or the day before that really we are in an epidemic of low social skills. And I see it whenever I am in a position that I need to receive some kind of customer service.
Hmm.
So, you go to a fast food restaurant and the person taking your order says nothing. They just stare at you. And it's unnerving,
Yeah.
but common now. Yes, I see it everywhere. You,
Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned that your the things that you share on Twitter have changed a lot since you got married.
Hmm.
How have they changed?
Oh my God, I've thought so much about this. um when I started on Twitter, I was pretty young. Like I was in my early 20s.
Uh-huh.
I think I was just turning 21. And I feel like I knew a lot of things. And I think this is like the hubris of just being young as well, where you just like you're like, I'm right and nobody else is right.
What did you
And
think you knew?
I think I knew things that, I hadn't really experienced. So I think, um, obviously, like I used to give a lot of like dating and relationship advice, and I used to give a lot of maybe even like parenting advice. I'm not a parent,
Right.
I'm still not a parent. Um, those things, it's hard to explain why I think that's such a big deal, but I'm gonna try. Like I see that a lot on Twitter now. I
Mm,
see people just like naively sharing their opinions on things that they've never been through,
mm,
that they don't know the pain of having gone through,
mhm,
that they won't understand like the difficulty or the struggle somebody may face in trying to accomplish the things that we're talking about.
mhm,
Like even something like, finding a partner or finding a husband or a wife. That's not an easy thing, but we like to give advice as if it's an easy thing,
mm, mm.
right? Um, just like a like way of life and everything like that. I think what I ended up realizing is that in your early 20s, you like rapidly change as a person because you go through many different experiences. And this was a thing that my husband actually pointed out that I really, really like is that when you're from like 18 to like maybe 22, you're still trying to understand who you are and what you believe,
Mhm.
right? What do you believe about the world? What do you even believe about yourself? Like, do you even know your own personality? Do
Mm.
you even know concretely what are your likes and dislikes? What are you willing to tolerate? What are you not willing to tolerate? Who do you like to be friends with? Who do you not like to be friends with? All of those things, you're just coming to terms with them. And when you don't know any of those things about yourself, you like project a lot of things onto other people in the world. And that's where a lot of um, opinions that are not really rooted in reality come from.
Can you think of anything specific that you've changed your mind about?
Oh, I can't think of anything specific, but I know I've changed my mind a lot about. Okay, yeah, actually, this is specific. So, as I said, like when I first joined Twitter, there was a lot of talk about like trad life and like trad movement, and like, women should stay at home and women shouldn't work, and women should 100% provide, not provide, but like, but cook the food and like clean the house, all those things. And like, I was really like buying into all of those ideologies because I was like, hey, like this is what femininity is. It's being a woman that, doesn't work. It's being a woman that just takes care of the house. It's being a woman that is 100% on top of everything all the time. The dishes are cleaned, the food is cooked and it's always delicious. I was like, this is what being a woman is. And if I want to be somebody of worth and value, I need to be that. And so I started to like really dive into that and really try to make that my personality. And like it really became what people call a pick me. Like it's like a girl who really like a girl who really just wants a man to tell her that she has value, right?
Mhm.
And that's what's happening right now to a lot of women. Like they're being told, "Hey, you need to be a certain way to be loved." And men are being told that too.
Sure.
But I'm going to talk about it from the female perspective because I am a woman. And so when I got married, that ideology was still very much rooted into me. And so, the first month of my marriage, I was like trying to do everything. I work, but I was also trying to like, make sure, the meals were cooked and the meals were like beautiful. I was like making sure the house was clean 24/7. I was like doing all of those things that would make me appear like I really had everything together. I really had everything together. And my husband just like he comes up to me one day and he's like I was noticeably stressed. So what that did was it impacted my mood a lot. I would just get
Mhm.
stressed out. I was trying to keep up with everything. My mood would drop. And then I wasn't the wife that was loving and like fun and, sweet. I was the wife that was stressed out all the time. And so My husband just comes up to me and he's like, I don't know why you decided that you had to be perfect. Like, I don't know why you decided that you have to do everything yourself and that you can never ask for help or that I can't help you. I don't know where you got the notion that the meals have to be cooked all the time. Like, if you don't have the time, we can order out. That's okay, you know? And like, he was like, we can hire a chef. Like, you don't have to do all of this. And that moment for me was like, I had to really rethink everything because I was like, well, Twitter taught me that to be loved by you, I have to do all of those things. And
Mhm.
like for you to not divorce me and like leave me and like get fed up by me, I have to, I have to do the things that are my responsibility. And so that was really a turning point for me because like I luckily ended up marrying somebody and I don't, like that's the really rare thing as well because there are men that will expect you to do all of those things.
Mhm.
Like there are females that I've spoken to or women that I've spoken to in marriages where their husbands expect them to do all of that. But like I ended up marrying a man who was like, hey, you don't have to do any of that. Like I never asked for any of that. And that doesn't mean that like you don't have to do anything. Like, of course, like do the things that you want to do. But if you're ever tired or if you can't do something, I'm going to take care of you 100%.
Mhm.
So I like if you're following along, like that's the notion that we as women are being sold right now from the trad movement, where it's like, cook everything from scratch and like learn a new recipe every week and like do all of those things. But the reality is that we live in a world that is different from all of those things. The reality is a lot of women have to work. And then on top of that, if they're also expected to then come home and do everything else, you are going to end up with a woman that's not going to be happy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so when a lot of men like complain, like, oh, my woman nags at me, or my wife is always nagging, or my wife is always in a mood, is like, how much of that responsibility of like taking care of the household and the kids and then working at the same time is falling on her shoulders?
Right. Right. One of the points I've made repeatedly is that the red pill movement, which for people who don't know, I would say the red pill movement is really the precursor to sort of the trad man life.
Mhm.
Uh, I would say the the point I've made many times about the red pill movement is that so much of it is built on three or four general rules of thumb that are probably true and probably neglected by our mainstream society. So, a good example, red pill people like to talk about hypergamy a lot. Women, and they sort of interpret that to mean all women always will choose the highest status man possible.
Mhm.
When to interpret it more broadly is simply to say a woman is looking to marry a man she can look up to. Right.
Right.
There's a little differently, a little softer interpretation. And the problem with the red pill is when it goes from general rules of thumb that help men understand how women think and feel to
Mhm.
an ideology. And maybe what you're pointing out is that part of what an ideology is when these sort of general rules of thumb get promoted by people who have no or very little actual experience in the lived world. And so
Yes.
they're making pronouncements about how reality is without having experience in those situations. The other thing I often think too is that a lot of these people, the red pillars, the hardcore trads, etc.,
Mhm.
they are people who inwardly, I think, are very frightened, probably, by the vicissitudes of history and by
Mhm.
the unsettled nature of our daily lives. And so they don't have the inner security to really work through at any deeper level. How do I take this principle, which I believe to be eternally true, and find some way to try to adhere to it in the middle of all the uncertainty of daily life and all of the many, many ways that the variables of daily life can shift? Uh,
Yeah.
how do I, for example, as a trad wife, what do I do when my husband is paralyzed in a car accident and in a way that he's not at fault for?
Yeah.
Now what? Right? And the part of the difference between a set of useful ideas and an ideology is that the set of useful ideas is flexible enough to actually apply to lived situations,
Yeah.
whereas ideologies are rigid and they fall apart under the pressure of, like I said, the vicissitudes of history. You know.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's the same, like there's the red pill ideology, but there's also like the radical feminist
Mm-hmm.
like movement as well. And I would say like that applies more to a lot of women are just like afraid of, because like the rad fem movement will like say things like, well, yeah, all men are like, all men are like animals and like they will cheat on you and like all of these things. And so when women are exposed to things like that, it puts them in this position where it's like, if I want to be worthy of love, if I want a man to choose me and stay with me, I have to become something that is going to please him. That is going to, make him not just like make him at a personal level happy, but like appease his more like natural instincts.
His
And
animal part.
animal part. And I think that's the part of the entire movement and the ideologies, as you were saying, which people are now, they're not dealing with human beings. Like they're not thinking that they're dealing with human beings. Like
Mm-hmm.
they think they're dealing with animals. Like when you say the hypergamy thing, that's like when it's taken into ideology format, you're saying that a woman has no control over her emotions and has no control over how she feels about somebody. Her baseline animal instinct will always take over,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that is the problem. We're reducing people to animals. We're saying that you don't have any control over how you think, how you feel. That's also one of the biggest shocks that I've had. All of the things that I learned about how men can be have turned out to be wrong.
Tell me more about that.
Right. So again, there's this like, thing of, oh, well, men are always going to be attracted to tons of women. And they're always going to be looking. They're always going to be, you're always in danger of your husband just leaving you for somebody else. Right. And so I choose to have open conversations about these things with my husband because we've created an environment where it's safe to do that. Like I don't have to be worried about saying something like that because he's made me feel safe enough to have these conversations with him. And I'm like, I always, if I'm confused about something, I just ask, like, hey, like, there's this like belief or there's this ideology about men and I want to hear about it from you because you are a man. Like I want you to tell me, is that true? Right? And so that those are some of the things where it's like it's okay to have those open conversations. But back to your point of like, what are some of those things? That's one of them. It's like, are you always like looking at other women? Are you always, like, are you always like a slave to your whims? And he's like, no, not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like once you get married and you love somebody, like of course there's natural instincts for both male and female, but it's not to the extreme that people kind of portray it as.
Mm-hmm.
It like, like it's a lot more, I would say, mellow than people make it out to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the problem. I think from the outside, and as you said, if you've never been in these experiences, if you've never been in a marriage, if you've never been in a relationship and had these conversations and just talked to people, you're going to take that baseline ideology and you're going to say this applies like at large to everybody. Right. And I'm not saying that there aren't men that are more inclined to, cheat or that are, but at the end of the day, if you treat them like, if you're saying that men just have no self-control, that's wrong.
Right. Right. Yes. It's so much of the red pill movement is really just extremely materialistic and essentially in denial about the soul or about the spiritual nature of people. And ironically, so much of the trad life movement has embraced that unknowingly. And so you have this movement that wants to return to the traditions of the West. But the tradition of the West is Christianity. And you have these trad life people who, on one hand, want to return to the tradition of the West while also embracing, at a deeper level, a very modern and mechanistic understanding of the person. And this is why the online version of the trad life will go nowhere, because it is in its way soulless.
Yeah. That's a big topic, and that's a big point, like the soul. That's something that I've been pinpointing since I first got on Twitter, because I read Carl Jung, Man and His Symbols, when I was, I believe, 20 years old, and it completely changed my life. Like that is the
What did you learn from it?
So that book was where I first, and it's weird to say first because I grew up in a religious household. Like I grew up going to the mosque. Like I was raised Muslim, and so I grew up going to the mosque, and I was taught about like eternal damnation, and like a lot of it is similar to Christianity. And so I was taught about like the prophets. I was taught about what being a good person means and all of these things. But none of it ever registered really, because when you think about religion being taught, it's often taught in this mechanism where it's all about like behavior, like you have to be good, otherwise you're going to go to hell. It's fear-based, and so it doesn't register beyond that. Like it doesn't register beyond like, is there some deeper meaning here, right? Is there some actual benefit to me paying attention to all of these things other than the fact that I'm just going to go to hell if I don't, right? So when I read Man and His Symbols, I'm about 20 years old, and that's when I really register the concept of the soul for the first time, because he's not really talking about religion. He's talking about the modern man and what he has lost. Right. And so he's not really talking about, like, Carl Jung had like this way of talking and writing where he never really brought in God and religion explicitly. It's more of like he just kind of like creates these ideas and puts them together. And so he would say like, well, a lot of people are just not in touch with their soul anymore. And that's when I really started to ask myself, well, what does it mean to be in touch with your soul? And he would come up with all of these like different examples of the ways we've lost touch with our soul. So, he would say like we use food and like medicine as kind of like as what's the word here? As an alternative to like feel something, basically. Like we eat a lot and we take a lot of medicine and we drink a lot of alcohol and all of these things because we're trying to, feel something where religion would usually fill that gap. Right. And so that's when you see like stuff like lust and like gluttony. Like, why are these considered like the 7 deadly sins? Why are they part of that? It's because people will resort to these things when they have no meaning in their life. They'll resort to drinking alcohol and taking drugs and like eating a lot of food like randomly, because there's nothing else really to, there's no other meaning beyond just I'm a human body and this is what my body desires and craves. And so that's when I started to understand there's a distinction between who we are as God made us. Like what is a soul? Like there's a distinction between the soul and the human body and the human desires that we have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where my psychology like teaching really helped, because we learn a lot about the cognitive, which is the mind. We learn a lot about the mind and chemical imbalances and all of these things. And I'm like, okay, so if as humans, you know, we have whims and we have like these imbalances that can affect us, well then like what about the soul? Like what role is the soul playing in that? You know, that's when I got all of this. So the man and his symbols was really an introduction to the soul.
Mm.
That's what it was. And then I started to dig deeper. And you know, I don't know if you ever heard of Al-Ghazali, but he was like this Sufi philosopher, and he would talk about how the material possessions that we have don't truly fulfill us, right? And the worldly things that we seek after, they're only the only reason we do all of those things is because we have a warped sense of meaning.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Our sense of meaning comes from our mind and not our soul. And
Mm.
if we were just able to like recalibrate and be like, okay, well, what is our soul seeking? We would find the answer to be completely different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Given what we said earlier about being active on Twitter lets you predict the future,
Mhm.
where do you think all this might be going?
Oh, um, it's hard because I mentioned I have a younger sister and I like to talk to her a lot about these things. She's just going like she just went into university. So she's around a lot of people that are in that position of like, you know, that I was talking about earlier, where it's like, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Who am I?
Yeah.
What am I seeking? Right? What are my goals? What is my purpose? I think those questions really bog down when you're young. Like they really, really make you feel like hopeless at a time, because you feel like there's no answer to any of those things and you're just
Right.
forced to trudge along and like figure something out. Um, I think what Twitter has done well is it has gotten a lot of these ideas out there, as in like, oh, if we're talking about you know, meaning, if we're talking about purpose, if we're talking about vision, all of those are positive things. And if they're somehow able to get out into the culture, that will be a net positive,
Mm-hmm.
because people will start to actually ask, and I don't see people asking themselves this, is like, what is my soul?
Mm-hmm.
What is my soul's purpose? If we were able to get that into young people's heads, it would make a difference. At the same time, we have this disposition as human beings to learn through experiences. And I think you were mentioning this earlier, where it's like you were talking about that song where it's like people don't really learn fast enough. Like they have to truly go roll with the punches and go through all of the bad things in order to come to a conclusion and for it to stick. You know, so when I think about all of these things, like I try to communicate with my sister, you know, you need to make good choices and here's why. And
Mm-hmm.
here's what purpose is and here's what, you know, you should really be worried about. I don't know if it registers unless she goes through some kind of life altering experience that will help her connect the dots,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know?
Speaking of your sister and of, I'm sure there are many young and younger-ish women on Twitter who are reading these things right now. From your perspective, what would you like them to know?
Oh my God. Okay. Young women. So you're saying women under what specific age?
Your age.
Okay.
Well,
I,
let's not even say younger. Let's just say women of any age who are
yeah.
on Twitter, who are in, or even in just in the culture, who are still struggling to figure things out? What
Yeah.
have you figured out that might be helpful for them to know?
Don't be in a rush to get married.
Why?
Like, don't not like, don't. Okay, here's what I really want to say. Marriage is a good goal to have. It's a really purposeful goal to have. It's a really soulful goal to have. I think marriage is a net positive. Don't put marriage at an altar and think that your worth and value is determined by somebody choosing to marry you, because that leads to this cycle of, I want to become somebody that a man will love. And while, marriage is a noble goal, you should never go into it because you feel that that's the only thing that will give you value as a woman.
Okay.
Right? It's not just being picked that will give you value. I see a lot of young women go through this where they're like, I need to get married. I need to just like be with anybody that will, anybody that wants me, I will take. That's wrong, because you will end up with people who will abuse that. They will abuse your naivety, right? And they will abuse this, this vision that you have for your life, because they'll see that the one thing that you want is to get married, and they'll exploit that to some sense. You don't want to be in a position like that. I would say the things that I wish that I had done when I was younger is focus more on myself and just being the best person I possibly could be. That's what will attract the right partner to you when the time is right. It's not going out and chasing that goal. It's not going out and chasing that man. It's not, going out and chasing this vision of marriage that you have. It's, the things that you mentioned, Dean. It's, what is your purpose? What's your vision? What gives you meaning? What are some skills that you can pick up? What are some ways you can learn social skills? How can you become a woman that when a man of character and dignity and integrity comes across, that he's attracted to all the things that you naturally are, and not the things that you think that a man will find attractive?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I ended up marrying somebody who respects me, loves me, cares for me. Like, my husband will go to the ends of the earth for me. I can say that confidently. And also, he's a great man in and of himself. He works really hard. He has goals and ambitions for his life. He's had those since before we met, right? And because our goals and visions aligned, not just in terms of marriage, but in terms of a greater purpose that we see for our lives, that's why we got married. So think of that greater purpose for yourself. How can you get closer to it? And the person that aligns with that purpose will find you.
Very good. Tell people where they can hear more from you or read what you've written or something like that.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Tishrei. That's where I predominantly am. I don't have Instagram, don't have anything else. You can find me on Twitter.
Okay. Well, thanks again for doing this.
Thank you so much, Dean. I really enjoyed our conversation.